When I say the words Middle Ages, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For a lot of us, it's probably towering castles, right? Knights in shining armor, epic adventures. It's the history we've seen in movies and read in books. But tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on the legends and ask what life was really like back then.
And this idea, the code of chivalry, it's right at the heart of that fantasy. The noble warrior, sworn to do good, protect the weak, uphold justice. It's a beautiful image, this time of clear-cut good versus evil.
But here's the thing. What if that gleaming armor was hiding something a lot grittier, a much darker, and frankly, more uncomfortable truth? What if the world that most people actually lived in was nothing like the legends we love? That is exactly what we're going to dive into. We are peeling back all those romantic fairy tale layers to get a look at the grim reality of the Middle Ages, based on what actual historical accounts tell us. This slide really just says it all, doesn't it? On the left, you got the myth, huge feasts, noble knights, and beautiful castles. But the reality for almost everyone, well, that's on the right. Famine was a constant fear, war was unbelievably brutal, and the places people lived were, let's just say, squalid.
So let's get specific. If you weren't a king or a queen, what was your world like day to day? What were the rules you had to live by, the dangers you faced, the things you believed that shaped your entire existence?
To really wrap our heads around this, we're going to look at a few specific and honestly kind of shocking examples from this forgotten world. We'll see how they handled justice, what they called medicine, and the simple, brutal facts of just staying alive.
Okay, first up, let's talk about justice. In a time before DNA tests or crime scene investigators, how could you possibly prove someone was guilty or innocent? Well, for a while, the answer was something called the trial by ordeal. The idea here was that God himself was the ultimate judge and would perform a miracle to show the truth. Now, just try to imagine what this was actually like. Your only shot at proving you're innocent is to pick up a piece of red-hot metal and walk with it. Then they wrap your hand up, seal it, and you wait for 3 days. Your entire life, your fate, depends on whether that burn gets infected or not, which, had a lot more to do with a total lack of sanitation than it did with divine judgment.
So what happened if you just got sick? Medical science was all about this idea of the 4 humors in your body. They thought illness was just an imbalance. So you've got a fever, the doctor might say you have too much blood. And the cure? Bloodletting. They'd slap on some leeches or just cut you open to drain the excess blood. A trip to the doctor could literally be a death sentence. The cure was often way deadlier than the disease. And all of this, it leads to a single, absolutely devastating number: half. Half of all children born during this time never made it to their 5th birthday. 50%. Just let that sink in for a second. It paints this picture of a world that was just so incredibly fragile. And this daily struggle for survival happened in a world that would be totally alien to us. This quote gives you a little whiff of what it was like. Forget those pretty castle gardens. For most people, cities and towns were packed. They were filthy and they smelled awful. And it wasn't just unpleasant. It was a perfect breeding ground for all the diseases that made that 50% child mortality rate a reality. So after looking at all this grim, gritty detail, a really important question comes up. If this was the reality, why is the image we all have in our heads so completely different? And understanding that gap, well, that tells us a lot about ourselves.
Seriously, why? With all this evidence of just how hard and brutal life was, why does our collective memory just cling to the knights and the princesses? Why is there such a huge disconnect between the history and the story we tell?
Well, it turns out the answer is all about who was telling the story. A huge part of it was Victorian-era nostalgia. In the 1800s, people looked back at the Middle Ages and romanticized it as the simpler, more pure time. Then, of course, Hollywood came along and figured out that stories about brave knights sell a lot more tickets than stories about dysentery. But maybe the biggest reason is that for centuries, history was written by and for the rich and powerful. Their stories were about kings and queens, not the 99% of people just trying to get by. Look, embracing this darker, more complicated version of the past isn't about being negative. It's about being honest. It lets us appreciate just how incredibly tough and resilient people were back then. And it gives us a much more real, a much more authentic connection to them, not as fairy tale characters, but as actual human beings who lived and struggled. And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. When you look at our world today, with all of its own complexities, what are the fairy tales we're telling about ourselves? What myths about our own time do you think future historians are going to have to debunk?